Imagine, if you will, a weapon so terrifying and swift that its very name struck fear into the hearts of millions. It was known as the vengeance weapon by the Nazi regime, a symbol of the destructive power that Germany had spent years developing. This weapon, the V-1 flying bomb, was the world's first cruise missile, capable of raining death upon entire cities with almost no warning. Its role in the chaos of World War II was so profound that it sent shockwaves through military and civilian ranks alike. In this tale, we shall explore the history, the innovation, and the terrifying might of this deadly weapon of mass destruction, the Vengeance Weapon 1. It was the early hours of June 13, 1944, just before dawn, when the quiet skies over Kent were disturbed. The Royal Observer Corps, a group trained to spot enemy aircraft, watched in awe as strange, tiny objects cut through the dark, leaving behind brilliant exhaust trails and the unmistakable roar of engines. These were not typical airplanes. They seemed to move with an eerie precision, unmanned, as if controlled by an unseen force. Within moments, one of these machines crashed down in the East End of London, creating a massive explosion in the neighborhood of Bethnal Green. The blast was devastating, reducing homes to rubble and leaving 206 people homeless. Tragically, 6 lives were lost in the fiery wreckage. When investigators arrived, they found the remnants of this peculiar aircraft, pieces scattered in the gaping bomb crater. Initially, British newspapers reported that German Luftwaffe raiders were responsible for the carnage, though British officials knew better. German propaganda soon boasted of a new weapon that would cripple Britain. Their confidence forced the British Home Secretary to admit that the nation was under attack by something new: pilotless planes, or what the public quickly dubbed robot planes. Behind closed doors, the Allied command was in a state of panic. What if these new Nazi weapons had been deployed earlier? Could they have disrupted the plans for the D-Day landings? Could they have sown enough terror to break the British war economy and bring the entire Allied war effort to its knees? These were the very fears that haunted both British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and General Dwight D. Eisenhower as they strategized in the months leading up to the D-Day invasion. The terror of German technology had loomed over Europe since the 1930s. When German scientists first discovered nuclear fission in Berlin in 1938, the fear of a Nazi superweapon became very real. This discovery led to the Manhattan Project, an effort by Britain, Canada, and the United States to develop atomic bombs before the Germans could. Hitler himself spoke ominously of wonder weapons that would turn the tide of the war. While these speeches were often dismissed as mere bravado, hidden deep within Germany, the Nazi regime had been working feverishly on secret rocket programs. These programs would lead to the creation of the vengeance weapons, the most feared devices of the war. By the spring of 1943, British intelligence had caught wind of a rocket testing facility on the Baltic coast, where German engineers were developing what would become the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Churchill, always quick to act on such intelligence, ordered an airstrike on this facility, hoping to kill the rocket engineers and derail the program. In August of that year, British bombers hit the site, but the mission was only a partial success. While some engineers were killed, much of the research survived. Undeterred, the Allies shifted their focus, bombing missile storage and launch sites in northern France. By late 1943, as the D-Day invasion loomed, the Allies had committed significant resources to thwarting this new threat. But the German war machine did not slow down. In the spring of 1944, the American military became increasingly alarmed by reports of new German aircraft that could outpace anything in the Allied arsenal. The Me-163 rocket interceptor, introduced in May 1944, was faster than anything the Allies had seen before, capable of slicing through bomber formations with ease. However, its high speed also made it difficult to control, and after just 5 minutes of flight, it would run out of fuel, forcing the pilot to glide back to base. Allied fighter pilots soon adapted, learning to shoot down the Me-163s during their vulnerable landing phase. Then came the V-1 flying bomb. The Germans called it the Vergeltungswaffe 1, or Vengeance Weapon 1. British civilians, upon hearing its distinctive buzzing engine, gave it the nickname Doodlebug, or Buzz Bomb. While it was not the technological marvel that its successor, the V-2, would become, The V1 was still a terrifying weapon. Its simplicity was its strength. Made primarily of sheet metal, it was cheap to produce and could be assembled quickly. It resembled a small stubby airplane, with short wings and an 80-octane gasoline-powered engine. Due to its limited range of 148 miles, the V1 had to be launched from northern France, where the Germans had built special ramps angled toward London. The terror began in earnest in June 1944. Over the next 3 months, the Germans launched more than 8,000 V1 flying bombs at Britain, most of them aimed at London. The results were catastrophic. More than 5,500 people were killed, 16,000 were wounded, and nearly 1 million were forced to evacuate their homes. The British fought back with everything they had, deploying fighter interceptors, anti-aircraft guns, and even barrage balloons to shoot down the V1s before they could reach their targets. By September, as Allied forces advanced across Europe, they managed to capture many of the V1 launch sites, temporarily halting the attacks. But the threat was far from over. The Germans soon began launching V1s from bombers, and their new targets were cities in Belgium, particularly the vital port of Antwerp. The Nazis even developed upgraded versions of the V1, but by the time they were ready, the war was nearing its end. In total, more than 30,000 V1 bombs were produced during the war. Of those, nearly 25,000 were fired at targets in Belgium and England. Around 7,000 of them reached England, with less than 4,000 making it to London. How did the Nazis create such a devastating weapon? Since the 1930s, German engineers had been working on flying bombs and rockets. Their secret research center was hidden on the Baltic coast, near the Polish border, at a site called Peenemünde. It was here that Werner von Braun, the brilliant but controversial rocket scientist, led the development of the V2 rocket. Hitler, always hungry for new ways to crush his enemies, became obsessed with the idea of superweapons. In 1942, he accelerated the development of the Vengeance weapons, hoping they would turn the tide of the war. The Luftwaffe, not wanting to be left behind in the arms race, developed their own pilotless bomb, which eventually became the V1. The first test flights of the V1 began in December 1942, while the V2 would make its debut a year later. The Germans had planned a massive operation, codenamed Operation Eisbär, or Polar Bear, which would unleash a combined assault of V1 and V2 missiles on London. Hitler, fixated on revenge, saw these weapons as the key to winning the war. The first V1 attack on London came just a week after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The Nazis had hoped that these weapons would disrupt the Allied invasion, but their accuracy was so poor that they were just as likely to hit German positions as they were to hit the enemy. Each V1 was launched from a tilted ramp, with a piston catapult providing the initial thrust. Once airborne, the V1's pulse-jet engine kicked in, propelling the bomb across the English Channel at a speed of 400 miles per hour. For the people of London, the sound of an approaching V1 was terrifying. The engine produced a distinct buzzing noise, often compared to an old Model T Ford struggling up a hill. When the buzzing stopped, it meant that the bomb had reached its target. Londoners had mere seconds to take cover before the bomb exploded, leveling buildings and tearing through streets. Although the V1's 1,130-pound warhead was not particularly large compared to some of the bombs dropped by conventional aircraft, the psychological impact was immense. The unpredictability of the attacks kept people on edge, never knowing when or where the next bomb would fall. For 7 long weeks, London endured the onslaught of the V1s. Churchill, ever the voice of defiance, admitted that between 100 and 150 flying bombs were being launched at Britain every day. He calculated that, on average, each bomb claimed 1 life. The destruction was widespread, but the spirit of the British people remained unbroken. By the end of 1944, the Allies had gained the upper hand. The capture of the V1 launch sites, combined with the eventual defeat of Germany, brought an end to the reign of the buzz bombs. But the legacy of the V1 would live on, influencing the development of modern cruise missiles and reminding the world of the terrifying power of technology in the hands of those bent on vengeance. Imagine a world where the skies themselves become instruments of fear, where a single drone-like hum could spell doom for thousands. Historian Rick Atkinson once described how the glass panes of buses in London simply disappeared, as though swept away by an invisible hand. The city was battered, with home after home laid to waste, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. On August 3, 1944, this relentless assault reached its climax. On that day, 316 V-1 missiles were launched toward London, with around 220 reaching their target. The terror was palpable, as a V-1 buzz bomb narrowly missed Buckingham Palace, striking a massive ash tree on the royal grounds and exploding mid-air, sending shockwaves that shattered the windows of the majestic palace. The British response to this dire threat was both clever and daring. Using double agents, they fed false reports to the Germans, tricking them into retargeting areas that were less populated, sparing London's core while sacrificing the lives of those in the outskirts. In a review by the Daily Express, Nigel Blundell remarked that this deception had to remain secret, not just to mislead the Germans, but also to keep the truth from the British public. Those living in the southeast suburbs and countryside had their lives endangered so that central London might survive. By mid-August, the Germans began withdrawing from their V-1 launch sites in northern France, knowing that the advancing Allied forces would soon capture them. On September 7, 1944, the last buzz bomb was launched from France. In total, 8,617 V-1s had been launched between June and September, a staggering number that terrorized Britain. Yet nearly half of these flying bombs either crashed on takeoff or were shot down by British defenses. Only a quarter of the missiles actually reached London, and many of those landed far off target. As the Allies gained control over northern France, the Germans started relocating their launch sites to eastern Germany, turning their attention to targets on the European continent. On September 7, just as the British government declared that the Battle of London was over, the first of the even more terrifying V-2 rockets fell upon the city. Unlike the V-1, which could be intercepted or shot down, the V-2 was a ballistic missile, silent and deadly, giving no warning until the moment of impact. For the next 6 months, these missiles sporadically terrorized London, though their numbers were not as high as the V-1s. The Allied operation, codenamed Crossbow, which had targeted V-1 facilities, was largely deemed ineffective in stopping the relentless bombing. The British defense against the V-1s was a multi-layered system that proved remarkably effective. It consisted of 4 key elements: a fighter belt patrolling the sea, an inland fighter belt, a coastal line of anti-aircraft guns, and a final barrier of barrage balloons protecting London itself. The Hawker Tempest 5, a fast and agile interceptor, was particularly effective at shooting down V-1s, but they were limited in number. Between June and August, Tempest pilots managed to down 68 flying bombs. Other aircraft, like the Spitfire, the Mustang, and the Mosquito, also played critical roles in intercepting the missiles. The V-1's metal body was vulnerable to 20mm shells, but pilots had to be cautious not to fly too close. When a V-1 exploded mid-air, it hurled shrapnel in all directions. Some daring pilots discovered they could disrupt the missile's flight by tipping its wing, sending the bomb spinning out of control. This dangerous maneuver led to the destruction of several V-1s. When the skies were clear, British fighter planes had the advantage. However, the Germans adapted by launching their missiles during poor weather when the planes couldn't fly. The introduction of proximity-fused rounds from the United States dramatically improved the effectiveness of British anti-aircraft defenses. Around 8% of the V-1s that were intercepted were caught by barrage balloons, whose cables would ensnare the missile, causing it to detonate prematurely. In response, the Germans began fitting some of their V-1s with cable cutters to slice through the balloon defenses. By the end of August, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill estimated that only 1 in 7 V-1 bombs managed to make it through to London. The Germans, determined to continue their campaign, began modifying the V-1. They developed an air-launched version, which was dropped from Heinkel He-111 bombers. Between July 1944 and January 1945, approximately 1,600 air-launched V-1s were deployed against Britain, with nearly all of them targeting London. However, these air-launched bombs were less accurate than those fired from the ground. Half of the bombs dropped in September missed London by as much as 24 miles. By October, the V1 threat shifted to Belgium, particularly the port city of Antwerp, a vital hub for the Allied war effort. Between October 1944 and March 1945, the Germans launched nearly 12,000 V1 bombs at Belgium, more than they had sent to England. Yet, the accuracy of these bombs remained poor. Only 21 managed to hit Antwerp. During this period, the Germans also unleashed the V2 rocket on Belgium. On December 16, 1944, the deadliest day of the V2 campaign occurred when a rocket struck an Antwerp movie theater, killing 567 people in a single, devastating blast. As the war dragged on, the Germans turned their attention to developing a longer-range version of the V1 that could be launched from Holland and reach Britain. The result was the F1 variant, which had a larger fuel tank but a smaller warhead. While this gave the missile greater range, it reduced its explosive power. In March 1945, 275 of these new V1s were launched at England, but only 13 made it to London. In a last desperate attempt to inflict damage, the Germans began experimenting with a piloted version of the V1. The idea was that a pilot would guide the missile to its target, and then bail out just before impact. Several test flights were conducted, but the Luftwaffe ultimately abandoned the project in 1945, realizing it was a suicide mission in all but name. In total, over 10,500 V1s of various types were launched at England, with around 2,000 crashing during or shortly after takeoff. British defenses managed to shoot down 52.8% of those that made it into the air. While the V1s caused widespread destruction and terror, their overall impact on the outcome of the war was limited. The same could be said of the V2 rockets. Historian Richard Overy later remarked that the resources the Germans poured into developing these weapons could have been used to produce an additional 24,000 aircraft, an investment that could have had a far greater impact on the war. The Americans too learned from the V1, developing their own version called the JB-2 Thunderbug, using parts salvaged from crashed German missiles. However, with the war nearing its end, the project was never fully realized. In the aftermath of the war, many began to recognize the significance of the V-weapons as precursors to modern cruise missiles. Hanson Baldwin of the New York Times noted in August 1944 that while the flying bomb would not win the war, it was a weapon of the future. The V1 and its larger cousin, the V2, paved the way for the development of ballistic missiles and space exploration. Wernher von Braun, the mastermind behind the V2, would go on to become a key figure in NASA's space program, leading the development of the rockets that would eventually take humans to the moon. The V2, unlike the V1, was a true ballistic missile, launched from mobile platforms known as Mehlwagens. Though it used more advanced technology, its warhead carried the same amount of explosive power as the V1. The V2 campaign caused significant destruction, but was hampered by the limited number of missiles available. Of the 3,170 V2s fired at Belgium, England, and other countries, only about a third hit their intended targets. Unlike the V1, which could be intercepted mid-flight, the V2 was nearly impossible to stop once launched. It traveled faster than the speed of sound, making it invisible to both radar and anti-aircraft defenses. One notable incident occurred when a V2 rocket accidentally flew through a formation of B-24 bombers returning from a mission. One of the gunners, thinking it was a German fighter, opened fire and managed to destroy the rocket mid-air, one of the only recorded instances of a V2 being shot down. The V2 program came at an astronomical cost to the Germans. A post-war U.S. study estimated that the development and production of the V2 had cost the Germans around $2 billion, roughly the same amount that the Allies spent on the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. Yet, despite the enormous resources devoted to the V-weapons, their overall contribution to the war was minimal. Historian Stephen Zaloga noted that the entire V2 campaign dropped less explosive material on Allied cities than a single major RAF bombing raid on Germany. In the end, the V-weapons were more a symbol of desperation than a game-changer in the war. They caused fear and destruction but failed to alter the course of history. As the war drew to a close, the true legacy of the V-1 and V-2 became clear. They were the harbingers of a new era in warfare, one where missiles would reign supreme, and the skies would forever hold the threat of destruction.